Indonesia is currently presiding over the collapse of its freshwater ecosystems. Native and endemic fish populations are plummeting, aggressively displaced by invasive alien species that breed faster and consume more resources than the local environment can support. Species like the red devil, or Amphilophus citronellus, illustrate the scale of this displacement. In several major Indonesian reservoirs and lakes, this single invasive predator now constitutes 40 to 60% of the total fish biomass. The Indonesian state is fully aware of this biological threat. On paper, the country possesses a strict, comprehensive legal framework designed to prevent exactly this type of ecological takeover. Ministerial Regulation Paramen KP No. 19 of 2020 explicitly prohibits the entry, cultivation, and circulation of these detrimental species. The text carries specific criminal sanctions and fines for those who violate these protocols. This creates a stark disconnect between the orderly, rigid text of the national statutes and the swarming, unchecked biological invasion operating in the water itself. Indonesia's ecological defense is collapsing at the level of policy implementation, not biology. To understand why the laws are failing, we have to treat the Indonesian bureaucracy as an engineered system that is currently malfunctioning. We need to identify the mechanics behind the breakdown. We can diagnose this crisis using an implementation matrix. By running real-world data through two distinct theoretical filters, we can isolate the specific nodes of failure. Filter 1 is the Van Meter and Van Horn model. This framework evaluates the internal, bureaucratic mechanics of how a government executes its own laws. It measures specific variables, the clarity of policy standards, the allocation of resources, and the efficiency of communication between different government departments. Filter 2 is the Cheema and Rondinelli model, which shifts the focus outward toward external pressures. It evaluates the impact of environmental conditions, the nature of interagency relations, and the behavioral characteristics of the state officials responsible for implementation. Running the ecological crisis through these two frameworks reveals the exact points where the Indonesian state's defense mechanism is paralyzed. Applying our first lens to the front line of defense brings us to Indonesia's quarantine system. Law 21 of 2019 sets a high standard for border control, mandating strict quarantine protocols including official help certificates and scientific risk analysis for all imported species. However, the policy contains a fatal gap in its standards. While the law is robust at the point of entry, there are zero technical standard operating procedures for eradicating a species once it breaches the border and establishes a population. This lack of procedural clarity is aggravated by the state's budget allocation. State funding heavily prioritizes aquaculture productivity, farming fish for economic gain, which systematically starves freshwater ecosystem management and conservation efforts of capital. Consequently, quarantine technical implementation units often lack the basic facilities and personnel required to intercept invasive species at minor regional ports and local airports. Because these physical checkpoints are underfunded, the thriving digital black market for exotic invasive ornamental fish bypasses them with near total impunity. Laws without technical operating procedures or targeted funding function as little more than bureaucratic theater, leaving the nation's ecological borders entirely porous. Shifting to our second framework, the Cheema and Rondinelli model, we can see how jurisdictional silos force irrational physical outcomes. Consider the mass burial of the invasive Sapu-Sapu or sucker-mouth catfish in urban centers like Jakarta. This practice presents a paradox. A nation struggling with food security is actively burying thousands of tons of potential protein that could be utilized for animal feed or fertilizer. The root of this behavior is a mapping failure between agencies. The Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries, or KKP, is the agency responsible for regulating the fish themselves. However, the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, or KLHK, holds jurisdiction over the quality of the water those fish inhabit. In many urban areas, those rivers are severely contaminated with unmanaged industrial heavy metal pollution. The Sapu-Sapu is a benthic, or bottom-feeding fish. Over its life cycle, it absorbs and concentrates these heavy metals into its tissues through bioaccumulation. This contamination breaks the circular economy. The KKP cannot process the extracted fish into animal feed because the biomass is highly toxic, and the heavy metals would eventually migrate into the human food chain. Since the agencies cannot coordinate to stop the upstream pollution, the state is forced into massive reactive sanitary burials to prevent public health crises. Siloed governance prevents a unified response. Because one agency fails to control the water, the other is paralyzed in its handling of the biology, forcing an irrational ecological dead end. When we combine these models to examine implementer disposition, we see how ground-level officials actually interpret and execute the law. Investigators treat environmental law as ultimum remedium, applied only as an absolute last resort. This reactive posture is mathematically useless against a biological threat reproducing exponentially. By the time the state acts, the invasion is a permanent fixture. This inaction is exacerbated by external economics. Poverty around urban rivers drives a dangerous black market for these toxic invasive fish as cheap, unregulated food. The state apparatus itself has become a primary vector for the invasion, often driven by a systemic lack of ecological literacy. Local government officials frequently conduct highly publicized releases of invasive tilapia, known locally as Nila, into natural, public waterways. These events are executed for political optics, framed as efforts to boost food security and provide local livelihoods. The ecological outcome is the opposite of the political intent. These state-sponsored releases cause the rapid displacement and extinction of endemic species, like the local goby fish. The introduction of tilapia alters the entire community structure and trophic chain of Indonesia's island lakes and rivers. When state implementers prioritize short-term political gains over ecological science, the law doesn't just fail, it actively engineers the crisis. Treating invasive species as isolated, local anomalies is obsolete. The speed of the spread has outpaced the current fragmented bureaucratic strategy. The hard truth is that absolute eradication is mathematically impossible under the current fragmented structure. The state must pivot from passive prohibition to a strategy of active, incentivized extraction. This requires an economic shift. The state must pay local communities a direct bounty per kilogram of invasive biomass extracted from the water. To make this viable, the government needs to subsidize industrial detoxification processing, allowing the heavy metal contamination to be handled before the biomass enters the secondary economy. This transition depends on a legal philosophy known as responsive law. Responsive law is a framework that prioritizes adaptive regulation over rigid policing. It demands active community participation and flexible regulations that can keep pace with evolving research on invasive species. Aligning immediate economic incentives with long-term environmental goals is the only way to scale the state's response to match the biological threat. Executing this strategy requires a single comprehensive national action plan for invasive species. This plan must mandate cross-sectoral integration, forcing the KKP, the KLHK, the National Police, and the National Research and Innovation Agency, or BRIN, into a single task force. This unified structure allows scientific research, water management, and law enforcement to trigger simultaneously. Indonesia faces the permanent erasure of its freshwater biodiversity, leaving behind a landscape of toxic, alien monocultures. The survival of these endemic ecosystems now hinges entirely on the coordinated, uncompromising execution of state law.